On the night of November 22nd, 1987, a television signal serving over 2 million households across Chicago was taken over by an unknown person, twice within the same 2-hour window, using equipment that federal engineers later concluded cost more than most people's annual salary to assemble. The Federal Communications Commission launched a full investigation. The FBI assisted. Both agencies had the legal authority, the technical resources, and the institutional mandate to find whoever did this. They found nothing. No arrests were ever made. No suspects were ever formally identified. The case file remains open to this day, and what the intruder actually said on camera has been decoded, frame by frame, by thousands of independent researchers over nearly 4 decades, and it still does not fully make sense. This is not a ghost story. This is an engineering problem that has never been solved. To understand why this event registers as anomalous rather than simply criminal, you need to understand who was watching television in Chicago on that particular Sunday night and what they were watching. Dan Roan was a 34-year-old sports anchor at WGN-TV, Channel 9, one of the most powerful independent television stations in the United States. WGN was not a regional outlet. By 1987, it had achieved superstation status. Its signal fed via satellite to cable systems across the country, giving it an estimated national audience of over 8 million households on any given night. Roan had spent years building his career at the station, and on November 22nd, he was doing what he did every Sunday, delivering the evening sports recap in front of a live broadcast audience. He was mid-sentence, reporting on Chicago Bears highlights, when something happened that had never happened to a major American television broadcast before. His face disappears from the screen. For approximately 25 seconds, the roughly 2 million households tuned to WGN-TV Channel 9 see something else entirely. A figure wearing a latex mask modeled on the fictional AI character Max Headroom, a pixelated, glitching simulacrum of a newscaster that had become a cultural icon through a 1985 British film, a subsequent TV series, and a series of Coca-Cola advertisements, moves erratically in front of a sheet of corrugated metal rotating behind them. The figure waves, twitches. The audio on this first intrusion is never successfully decoded. The WGN engineering team, monitoring from within the station, registers the anomaly almost immediately, but by the time they can act, the signal has returned to Dan Roan. He continues his broadcast. He does not learn what appeared in his place until after the segment ends. The incident was logged. The FCC was notified. And then, approximately 2 hours later, it happened again. This time, the target was WTTW, Channel 11, Chicago's PBS affiliate. The broadcast in progress was an episode of Doctor Who, the British science fiction series that, by 1987, had accumulated a dedicated American viewership. The episode airing was Horror of Fang Rock, and several thousand viewers in the Chicago metropolitan area had settled in to watch it. At approximately 11:15 p.m., the screen cuts. The same figure returns, same mask, same rotating corrugated background. This time, the audio works. What follows is approximately 90 seconds of content that engineers, linguists, cultural analysts, and amateur investigators have been attempting to fully decode ever since. The intruder speaks. He produces erratic vocalization, part speech, part humming. He references a can of New Coke. He invokes the name of a 1950s animated television program called Clutch Cargo, a low-budget series notable for its technique of superimposing live human lips over animated faces, producing an anomalous visual effect rooted in the biological mechanical disconnect between drawn form and living tissue. He extends his middle finger at the camera. At one point, a second individual enters the frame, partially obscured, wearing a French-made costume, and strikes the masked figure across the exposed lower body with a fly swatter multiple times. The masked figure laughs. Then the signal drops. Doctor Who resumes. The entire intrusion lasts between 85 and 90 seconds, depending on which recovered recording you reference. The WT2 engineering team does not successfully terminate the override. They do not have the capability to do so in real time. The intruder ends the broadcast on their own terms. To understand how significant a technical achievement this was, it is necessary to understand how over-the-air broadcast television signals functioned in 1987. A broadcast station like WGN or WTTW transmitted its signal from a tower, in WGN's case, from the top of the John Hancock Center at a height of approximately 457 meters above street level. That transmitter operated at a licensed power output that the FCC had authorized, regulated, and documented. The signal it sent was not encrypted. In 1987, encryption of standard broadcast television was not yet standard practice, nor was it technically feasible at the consumer scale. The signal was simply the strongest version of itself, and whoever transmitted a signal on the same frequency at a higher effective power, positioned with a direct line of sight to the receiving antenna infrastructure, would override it. This is the technical core of what happened. The intruder did not hack anything in the modern software sense. They outpowered a licensed broadcast transmitter. What this required was a portable uplink transmitter, a device capable of generating a signal on the precise licensed frequency of the target station at sufficient wattage to overwhelm the station's own output as received by the relay infrastructure. In 1987, the equipment needed to do this was commercially available, but expensive, required significant technical expertise to configure and operate, and was not the kind of hardware you could purchase at a consumer electronics retailer. The FCC estimated that the transmitter used would have cost in the range of tens of thousands of dollars to assemble or acquire. It also would have required a vehicle, a van or large vehicle, to transport and operate. The intruder positioned this equipment somewhere in the Chicago metropolitan area with a viable line of sight to the relevant antenna infrastructure. They coordinated the activation of the costume, the rotating background, which required a separate mechanical setup, and the transmission timing across two separate broadcast events occurring hours apart. They operated without detection before, during, or after either intrusion. They then disappeared. Federal Communications Commission Regulations under 47, USC Section 325, made unauthorized signal transmission a federal offense. The FBI's field office in Chicago joined the investigation. Neither agency produced a prosecution. Now here is where the investigation becomes interesting, and where a detail planted at the opening of this broadcast pays off. The intruder referenced clutch cargo. This is not random noise. Clutch cargo was a hyper-specific cultural artifact, a low-budget syndicated cartoon from 1959 that was notable and notorious for one specific technique: synchrovox, a process in which real human lips were filmed and then composited directly onto the animated faces of the characters. The result was anomalous. The characters' faces were static, drawn, essentially frozen, but their mouths were living, moving, human tissue. The biological-mechanical disconnect between the animated form and the living detail was precisely the kind of documented visual irregularity that made an impression on children who watched it, and on nobody else. The Max Headroom character, at its conceptual core, was built on an identical structural premise: a human being, or the simulation of one, rendered in a digital aesthetic, glitching and repeating, a face recognizably human in structure, but inconsistent in execution. The intruder did not reference clutch cargo accidentally. The reference was structurally coherent with the mask they were wearing. They were drawing a direct line between two different eras of television's attempt to simulate a human face through technological mediation, and getting it right. This matters to investigators because it tells you something precise about the intruder's profile. You do not casually know what clutch cargo is in 1987 unless you are a specific kind of person, someone with deep, analytical affection for the history of broadcast television, someone who grew up watching its edge cases, its technical failures, its aesthetic anomalies, someone who found the seams in the medium interesting rather than dismissive. The profile that emerges is not a random vandal or a thrill-seeking teenager. It is someone or a group of people with technical broadcasting knowledge sufficient to execute a federal-level signal intrusion, cultural knowledge specific enough to reach back 28 years to a niche television artifact, and the organizational capacity to design, construct, and deploy a multi-element production, mask, costume, mechanical rotating background, second performer, all inside the back of a vehicle, in real time, in the dark. The FCC interviewed engineering staff at both stations. They surveilled known amateur radio operators and unlicensed broadcasters in the Chicago area. They examined records of equipment purchases. They produced nothing. One of the most operationally significant details of the intrusion is the two-station sequence and what it reveals about the intruder's knowledge for Chicago's broadcast infrastructure. WGN-TV, Channel 9 transmitted from the John Hancock Center. WTTW Channel 11 transmitted from a different location, the Sears Tower Antenna System. These are not the same transmission point. They are physically separated in the downtown Chicago grid. If the intruder used a single vehicle-mounted transmitter, they would have needed to either reposition between the two intrusions, which took place approximately 2 hours apart, or they had identified a position in the Chicago urban landscape that provided adequate line-of-sight access to both antenna systems simultaneously. Federal engineers investigating the case were unable to definitively determine which scenario occurred. Both are technically possible. Both require a level of pre-operational site survey that speaks to significant preparation time. The 2-hour gap between intrusions is also notable. The intruder did not disappear immediately after the first hit. They waited. They reset. They executed a second, longer, more technically ambitious intrusion, this one with functioning audio, a second performer, and a prepared script of sorts, and then they left. No subsequent intrusion targeting either station was ever recorded. The action was taken exactly twice, then terminated. That operational discipline, 2 precisely executed intrusions, and complete withdrawal, is not consistent with impulse behavior. Theories regarding the identity of the intruder or intrusion group fall into several documented categories, and it is worth examining each one with a precise eye. The most persistent hypothesis is that the intrusion was the work of a small group of technically skilled individuals, likely 2 to 4, people operating within Chicago's amateur radio or broadcast engineering community. The equipment knowledge required is consistent with professional-level broadcast training or advanced amateur radio certification. The FCC's own technical analysis concluded that whoever operated the transmitter understood not just how to operate it, but how to configure it for optimal override, adjusting polarization, aiming, and power output with the precision of someone who had done this kind of work before in a legitimate professional context. The cultural specificity of the content, the clutch cargo reference, the max headroom character selection, the Doctor Who broadcast as the second target, suggests that at least one member of the group had a detailed, enthusiast-level knowledge of genre television and broadcast history. The selection of Doctor Who is particularly indexed. WTTW was the primary PBS outlet for Doctor Who in the Chicago market. The audience watching at 11:15 p.m. on a Sunday night was a defined demographic, specifically science fiction enthusiasts who would be alert to the irony of a signal intrusion occurring during a science fiction broadcast about time travel and anomalous phenomena. The intrusion was, in some sense, designed for its specific audience. That level of target selection speaks to either fortunate coincidence or deliberate cultural awareness. Investigators leaned toward the latter. A second theory, with considerably less supporting evidence, suggests the intrusion was an elaborate promotional stunt that went significantly further than intended, potentially connected to individuals working in Chicago's advertising or media production ecosystem in the mid-1980s. Max Headroom had been used in high-profile advertising campaigns in the United States, most notably for Coca-Cola, and the character's visual aesthetic was well known within media production circles. Several researchers have pointed out that the rotating corrugated metal background and the general production quality of the WTTW intrusion suggest not just technical capability, but production design familiarity. The kind of aesthetic choices made by someone accustomed to building sets for camera rather than simply standing in front of them. This theory has never been supported by documented evidence and remains speculative. A third hypothesis, one that circulates primarily in online investigation communities, is that the intrusion was directly connected to the internal cultures of Chicago's broadcast engineering community, and that one or more current or former employees of either WGN or WTTW were involved. This is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. The level of knowledge demonstrated, specifically regarding the technical window during which the override would be most effective, and the relay infrastructure vulnerabilities at each station, suggests insider familiarity. Both stations, as part of standard FCC cooperation, provided employee records to investigators. No prosecution followed. In the decades since 1987, the intrusion footage has been digitized, enhanced, analyzed frame by frame, and subjected to audio processing techniques that did not exist at the time of the original broadcast. Several statements previously considered unintelligible have been partially recovered through modern audio restoration. The intruder appears to say, at various points, things that are self-referential. Comments about the broadcast itself, about the act of interruption, delivered in a register that oscillates between coherence and deliberate nonsense. The tonal register is not that of a political manifesto or a credible threat. It is performative. It is, in some sense, television, a production designed to exist on a screen and to be received by an audience. That realization is perhaps the most precise summary of what makes this incident anomalous. The intruder did not use access to two major American broadcast frequencies to issue a demand, to threaten, to extort, or to expose. They used it to perform. They built a set. They cast a second actor. They selected a costume with documented cultural resonance. They chose targets with specific audience demographics. They established a visual language, the Max Headroom character, that already had an established relationship with television's self-aware commentary on its own artificiality. And then they broadcast it, federally legally, to approximately 2 million people, and they never claimed credit. The fly swatter makes no conventional sense in any threat-based analysis. Neither does the clutch cargo reference, or the Coca-Cola brand mention, or the erratic vocalization. Taken together, these elements do not constitute a message in any traditional sense. They constitute a transmission, something sent without a declared sender on a frequency that did not belong to the person sending it. The FCC maximum penalty for unauthorized broadcast transmission in 1987 was a fine of up to $100,000 per violation and potential imprisonment of up to 1 year per count. The intrusion constituted at minimum 2 separate violations. If the investigation had produced a conviction, the intruder or intrusion group was facing significant legal consequences. The investigation did not produce a conviction. Whether the intruders were aware of the legal stakes and planned accordingly, or whether their disappearance was simply a consequence of operational discipline and favorable circumstance, is not something any available evidence can resolve. What the available evidence can confirm is this: 2 licensed broadcast signals serving millions of people were overridden by an unknown party on the same night, using equipment that required significant financial investment and technical expertise in a way that was technically sophisticated, culturally specific, and operationally clean. The federal agencies with jurisdiction to investigate were unable to identify a single suspect for prosecution. The footage remains. The audio remains, partially decoded and partially not. The corrugated metal background, the mask, the fly swatter, the clutch cargo reference. All of it is documented, cataloged, and available to anyone with an internet connection and 90 seconds of attention. 37 years later, the only thing the FCC, the FBI, and every independent investigation since has been able to confirm with certainty is what the intruder was not. They were not incompetent. They were not impulsive. They were not caught. Everything else, who they were, why they did it, what they intended the transmission to mean, and where they went, remains an open question in a case file that has never been formally closed. The signal returned to Doctor Who at 11:17 p.m. The intruder has not been heard from since. Given the intruder's technical precision, cultural specificity, and complete disappearance, what is your assessment of their identity and operational motive?